The clock on my mahogany desk read exactly 6:47 a.m. when I noticed the silence. Not the peaceful silence of a man who's earned the right to wake without an alarm, though I had earned that right 40 years ago when I hung my first business license on a cramped office wall with my own trembling hands. This silence was different. This was the silence of something missing. The absence of presence. I sat up slowly in my king-size bed, the one with the Egyptian cotton sheets that cost more than my first apartment, and listened to the emptiness of my penthouse. 43 floors above downtown, surrounded by glass and steel and everything I'd built with nothing but my education and my willingness to work 16-hour days without complaint. And yet, somehow, I could hear my heartbeat in the quiet. That shouldn't have been possible. My name is Robert Patterson. I'm 73 years old. I built a law firm from scratch into one of the most prestigious practices in this state. We handle corporate mergers, intellectual property disputes, complex litigation that keeps Fortune 500 companies awake at night. My hourly rate hasn't dipped below $800 in nearly 2 decades. I've made more money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes. I have 3 Rolex watches in my study that I've never worn because they felt ostentatious even for me, a man who learned long ago that restraint is the final luxury. But none of that mattered on that particular November morning because I realized my son wasn't here. David should have been here. He'd texted me 3 days ago, or had it been 4, saying he needed to talk about something important. Could he come by? Of course, I'd said. Bring your family. Stay the weekend. The penthouse had space for everyone. It always did. I swung my legs out of bed, feeling the familiar protest of my knees, the small price of age and a life spent mostly sitting, reviewing briefs and depositions and the kind of details that could make or break a case. My hands had always been my real assets. Steady hands. Hands that knew how to gesture at just the right moment during closing arguments. Hands that could sign documents that changed people's lives, usually for the better, sometimes for the worse. I'd made peace with that contradiction years ago. The apartment was indeed empty. I moved through it like a man walking through a mausoleum of his own making. The living room with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The view I'd paid $4.2 million for in 2015. The kitchen with stainless steel appliances that gleamed like surgical instruments. The dining table that could seat 12 and had maybe 3 times since I bought it. Everything was exactly as it had been. Nothing was moved. Nothing was disturbed. And yet everything felt wrong. My phone. I pulled it from the charger on my nightstand and checked for messages. There was one, sent at 11:47 p.m. last night while I'd been sleeping. From David. Dad, we had to leave. Something came up. Don't worry about us. We'll call soon. David. I read it 3 times. Then a 4th time. The words didn't change. They never do, no matter how many times you read them. My son had been here in my home, had presumably gone to bed in one of my guest rooms, and then had gotten up in the middle of the night and left without a goodbye. Without an explanation. Without even the courtesy of waking me to say something in person. The anger came first. Sharp and hot, like a sudden intake of breath. I was about to call him when a second message appeared, this one from my daughter-in-law, Christine. Robert, David told me to text you. We're sorry for the confusion. Some family matters came up that we had to handle. We'll explain everything soon. Thank you for everything you've done for us. Everything I've done for them. That phrase hung in the air like a challenge. I moved to my study, a room lined floor to ceiling with law books, with photographs of me receiving awards, shaking hands with senators, standing in front of the office building that bears my name on the 32nd floor. Patterson and Associates. That had a nice ring to it. Still did. I opened my personal filing cabinet and pulled out a red folder marked David, Financial Records. Inside were receipts, bank statements, wire transfer confirmations. The story of a father's investment in his son's future. The down payment on David's first house, $180,000. The additional funds when the market crashed and he was underwater on his mortgage, $220,000. His business venture that didn't work out, $400,000 in startup capital. His wife's medical emergency that insurance didn't fully cover, $85,000. His kids' private school tuition, year after year, roughly $60,000 annually for the past 7 years. I did the math in my head, though I already knew. I'd been keeping this tally for years without admitting to myself that I was keeping it. Just over $2 million. In cash. Direct transfers from my accounts to his. Not loans. I'd never asked him to sign anything. Never requested repayment. Never even brought it up in conversation. My wife, Eleanor, had been alive for most of this. She'd watched me write check after check, and she'd never said a word until about 6 months before she passed. We were lying in the same bed, actually, and she'd turned to me in the darkness and said, "You know he'll never give it back." "He doesn't need to," I'd replied. "No," she'd said quietly. "But you'll eventually feel like he should have." Eleanor was usually right about these things. She'd been a therapist before we married, and even in retirement, she'd kept that clinical eye for human nature. She died 3 years ago. Cancer, fast and brutal. It took her in 9 months. After that, David had been here every week, checking on me, making sure I was eating, helping me with the paperwork and the practicalities of grief. For those 3 years, I'd felt like I finally had my son back, really back, not just the version that showed up when he needed something. I'd started giving again during that time. More money. Larger amounts. He'd mentioned wanting to expand his business. He ran a consulting firm that helped small companies with strategic planning. I'd given him $500,000 to hire new staff and open a satellite office. I hadn't asked how it was going. I hadn't checked on whether the business had actually expanded. I'd simply trusted him and written the check. That was my mistake, Eleanor would have said. But Eleanor wasn't here to say it. The morning light was getting stronger, spilling across my desk in that particular way that made the view of the city look almost unreal. I stood and walked to the window, pressing my palm against the glass. 43 stories below, people were beginning their days. Walking to work. Getting coffee. Living their small, contained lives where fathers didn't give their sons millions of dollars and wake up one day to find them gone. I pulled out my phone and called David. It went to voicemail immediately. His casual greeting, his voice exactly as I remembered it, asking me to leave a message. I didn't leave a message. I hung up and called again. Voicemail. Again. Voicemail. Then I tried Christine. Same result. It was 7:15 a.m. on a Monday morning, and my son had disappeared from my home in the middle of the night with nothing but a text message that said, "We had to leave." I sat down in my desk chair, Italian leather, cost me $8,000 when I bought it 10 years ago, and did something I hadn't done since Eleanor's funeral. I put my head in my hands and let myself feel the weight of things. The weight of time. The weight of money. The weight of trust that had somehow turned into something that couldn't be weighed at all because it had simply evaporated. By 8 a.m., I'd made several calls. First to my building's front desk to ask if they'd seen my son and his family leave. The night porter confirmed it. Around 2 a.m., David had taken down several large pieces of furniture from my apartment. Artwork, too. And boxes. Lots of boxes. The porter had asked if he should call building security, but David had shown him some kind of paperwork. The porter wasn't sure what exactly, and said it was fine. Furniture. He'd taken my furniture. My artwork. My things. I called my office and told my administrative assistant, Margaret, that I wouldn't be in. She protested. I had a strategy meeting at 10 a.m. with a team working on a medical malpractice case that could settle for $30 million. I told her to have someone cover it. I never missed meetings. I'd built my reputation on never missing meetings. But this morning, I couldn't move. I walked through my apartment cataloging what was gone. A painting that Eleanor had loved, a Rothko print I'd purchased for $240,000 because she'd once mentioned wishing she could own an original. Gone. The marble sculpture in the entryway, $150,000 for an unknown artist because I liked the way the light played across it. Gone. My leather furniture from the study, the set I'd specifically chosen because it was comfortable for 16-hour work sessions. Gone. And then I found the letter. It was on the kitchen counter, propped up against a decorative bowl like he'd been trying to decide if it was important enough to leave out or not. My name written on the outside in David's precise handwriting. I opened it with trembling hands. Dad, I know this will hurt you, and I'm sorry for that. But I need you to understand what it's like to grow up in the shadow of someone like you. To always feel like I'm not enough. My whole life, I've been trying to prove I could succeed on my own, but every time I struggled, you were there with money. Lots of money. Enough to make me feel both grateful and pathetic at the same time. Christine and I have been talking to a therapist, and she helped us understand something important. The money you've given me has come with strings attached. Not explicitly, but they're there. The expectation that I'm somehow indebted to you. That I owe you my loyalty, my gratitude, my constant appreciation. The furniture and the artwork you're noticing missing. I'm taking that as partial compensation for everything you've made me feel over the years. The shame of not being good enough. The weight of your expectations. The pressure of your success. I've also taken the liberty of accessing your safe deposit box with the documents and photographs that are personal to me. My childhood items, my medical records, anything that felt like it belonged to me rather than to the great Robert Patterson legacy. I don't expect you to understand this, but I needed to take my life back. In whatever symbolic way I could. David. I stood in my kitchen, holding the letter, and felt something crack inside my chest. Not my heart exactly. I'd always thought that was a metaphor anyway. It was something else. Something made of pride and certainty and the belief that I'd done everything right. I've made more money than most people dream of. I've lived exactly as I wanted. I've accumulated things and status and accomplishments. But standing in my penthouse at 8:47 a.m. on a Monday morning, looking at the empty spaces where beautiful things used to be, I realized I'd never learned the most important thing. I'd never learned how to know my son. Not really. Not the way a father should. I'd learned how to give him things. I'd learned how to solve his problems with money. I'd learned how to be absent in a way that felt like presence because I was always willing to pay the bill. But I hadn't learned him. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. A link. I clicked it, and my stomach dropped. It was a photograph of my safe deposit box. Open and empty. Except for a note on the bottom in David's handwriting. You can't buy your way out of this one. I sat down heavily at my kitchen counter and did something I rarely did. I cried. Not dramatically. Just quietly, with the kind of tears that come when you finally understand that you've lost something that money can't buy back. But even as I sat there in that empty penthouse, I realized something else. Something that made the tears stop. Something that made me stand up and walk to my study and pull out the second set of files I kept, the ones David didn't know about. I'd been building a case for 40 years. Documentation of everything. Every wire transfer, every purchase, every decision made on his behalf. It was all there. Organized. Categorized. Ready. Because I was a lawyer before I was a father. And lawyers know how to prepare for contingencies. And they know that sometimes the only way to win is to be willing to fight. The clock on my office wall read exactly 10:47 a.m. when Margaret called me. I remember the time precisely because I'd been staring at those numbers for the past 17 minutes, waiting for a client to arrive for what should have been a $2 million settlement discussion. The meeting was already delayed. My secretary had apologized twice. I'd waved her off both times, though inside I was irritated in that particular way that only a man accustomed to punctuality can be. When the phone buzzed, I almost didn't answer it. My personal line. Few people had that number. My ex-wife, though we hadn't spoken in 5 years beyond obligatory birthday calls to David. My accountant. My physician. And my mother, though she rarely called during business hours. She knew better. Dad. David's voice came through, and immediately I knew something was wrong. Not sick wrong or emergency wrong, but wrong in that subtle way a father knows when his son is hiding something. Where are you right now? In my office. Where I always am at this time on a Friday. Why? Are you alone? I closed my office door and locked it, a gesture I'd learned decades ago when dealing with sensitive cases. I am now. What's happened? What he told me over the next 15 minutes rewrote everything I thought I understood about my son. Not because the facts were particularly shocking. I'd seen enough of human nature in courtrooms to know that people are capable of remarkable deception. But because it was David. My son. The boy I'd sent to private school, Ivy League University, the young man I'd mentored into a consulting firm that actually turned a profit by his 3rd year. The boy I'd given everything. She's gone, David said. his voice hollow in a way I'd never heard before. Everything's gone. I listened as he explained. The move into the new apartment. The movers arriving that morning while they were celebrating Thanksgiving in Hawaii, a trip they'd planned for months, though apparently without any intention of inviting Margaret. Finding the house empty when they returned. Not ransacked. Not broken into. Systematically emptied, with surgical precision. The television. The furniture. The appliances. Even the artwork Margaret had admired. All of it gone. She took it all, Dad. Everything we need. The refrigerator, the washer, the dryer. How are we supposed to live without these things? I sat at my desk, my hand gripping the phone so hard my knuckles went white. Did you call the police? Of course I called the police. They came this afternoon. But here's the thing, Dad. They said there's nothing they can do. Why not? David's voice cracked slightly. Because she has receipts. For everything. Her name is on every single purchase. The officer basically said that legally, the stuff is hers, and she had every right to take it. I was quiet for a long moment, my legal mind already spinning through the implications. The officer was correct, of course. Legally correct, which in the law is the only kind of correct that matters. You can't steal something you own. You can't be charged with theft for removing your own property. Have you tried calling her? Dozens of times. She won't answer. Dad, I don't understand what happened. 3 days ago, everything was fine. She was making Thanksgiving dinner. She seemed happy. Then Amanda left that note saying we were going to Hawaii, and... You left her a note. Something cold settled in my chest. You didn't tell her in person? You didn't invite her? She wouldn't have liked the flight, David said, and I could hear Amanda's voice in those words, see her shrugging, see her making that casual decision about what her mother-in-law would or wouldn't enjoy without bothering to ask. I've spent 40 years reading juries, reading witnesses, reading the subtle shifts in human expression that tell you what someone really thinks beneath what they're saying. I've built a reputation on understanding motivation, on seeing the story beneath the facts. And in that moment, I understood my son's story completely. Where is she now? I asked. We don't know. We went to her old house, well, our house, and there was just this note on the counter. Her keys in a bow. And a stack of bills, all of them transferred to my name. Electric, water, internet, everything. I closed my eyes. Margaret, my daughter-in-law, the woman I'd watched my son marry 15 years ago, the woman who'd called me a blessing when I helped with the down payment on their first house, the woman who'd smiled while accepting check after check, gift after gift. She'd outplayed him, and she'd done it perfectly. Dad, what do I do? That's when I realized something that would have been funny if it wasn't so tragic. My son was asking me to fix this the same way I'd fixed everything else in his life. Write a check. Call a lawyer. Make the problem disappear. But this wasn't a problem that could be fixed with money or legal maneuvering. This was a problem that required understanding, and understanding required seeing the situation clearly. And I wasn't sure my son was capable of that. First, I said slowly, you're going to need to file a civil suit. You'll need to claim the items belong to you and the household, even if they're technically in her name on receipts. Will that work? I don't know, I admitted. I need to think about this. And you need to think about something, David. You need to think about why your mother felt she had to do this instead of just talking to you about it. There was silence on the line. Then, quietly, she didn't talk to us. She just left. Yes, she did, I said. You just weren't listening. After I hung up with David, I sat in my office for a long time, staring out at the city spread below me like a map of all the deals I'd brokered, the cases I'd won, the power I'd accumulated. 40 years of never being wrong. 40 years of being the smartest person in the room. And yet somehow, I'd missed this completely. I thought about Margaret, the woman I'd met when David brought her home from college. Intelligent, warm, kind in that way that felt genuine rather than performed. I'd approved of her immediately. She would be good for my son. She would ground him, balance him. She would make him better. And for years she had. But somewhere along the way, I'd stopped seeing her as a person and started seeing her as a supporting character in David's story. A wife. A mother. A helper. Not as Margaret. Not as a woman with her own needs, her own dreams, her own breaking point. The irony was particularly sharp because I was a lawyer. I understood contracts, agreements, written terms. But apparently, I didn't understand the unwritten contract between a family. The assumption that we take care of each other. That we consider each other. That we don't leave people behind like yesterday's breakfast. I called my office administrator and told her to cancel my remaining appointments. Then I did something I hadn't done in 15 years. I left the office early. My penthouse had a particular smell, expensive and empty. Fresh flowers that my housekeeper changed weekly but that never quite filled the space with life. The kitchen gleamed with stainless steel appliances I never used. I had a chef who came in twice a week to prepare meals. The dining table could seat 12. I couldn't remember the last time I'd had more than 2 people over for dinner. The photographs on my walls told the story of a man with an impressive career and a life that was somehow fundamentally lonely. Me accepting awards. Me shaking hands with senators. Me in front of my office building, the name Patterson and Associates bold against the glass. But no recent photos of David. No pictures of my grandchildren. No evidence that I had a family at all except as footnotes to my professional achievement. I made myself a drink, something that cost more than most people made in a week, and sat in my leather chair by the window. The sun was setting, turning the city orange and gold. It was beautiful in that particular way that expensive views often are. Beautiful and meaningless. I thought about David as a child. 7 years old, bringing home a painting from school, his face bright with anticipation as he showed it to me. A stick-figure family, badly proportioned, the colors bleeding into each other because he hadn't understood yet about staying within the lines. "That's very good, David," I'd said, and I'd meant it. But I'd been distracted, reviewing a brief for a case, and my approval had been more reflex than genuine. He'd wanted to put it on the refrigerator. I'd had my secretary frame it and display it in my office instead, where I could see it during business hours but where he rarely would. That painting was still there, actually, in a frame that probably cost more than the school supplies the teacher had used to create it. A monument to my distraction. The phone rang, pulling me from my thoughts. My secretary, calling from her apartment where she'd no doubt gone to recover from my early departure. "Mr. Patterson," I wanted to confirm, "are you all right? You never leave early." "I'm fine, Margaret. Just needed to handle something." There was a pause. "Do you need anything from the office?" "No. Take the weekend off. Enjoy yourself." Another pause, this one longer. "Will you be coming in Monday?" "I don't know," I said, and I meant it. "I'll let you know." After I hung up, I sat in the gathering darkness, not turning on any lights, just watching the city's lights begin to twinkle on below. Somewhere out there was Margaret Patterson. Not my wife, my ex-wife, technically, though that word had never felt quite right. Margaret Wright. The woman who'd married my son. The woman who'd been writing checks and wrapping gifts and showing up and trying, always trying, while I pursued the next case, the next victory, the next confirmation that I was the best at what I did. She'd finally decided she was done trying. I understood the decision completely. What I didn't understand was how she'd managed to plan something this elaborate without anyone noticing. The moving company. The apartment. The careful documentation of every purchase. The timing of it all, waiting until they were in Hawaii, unable to do anything immediately. It was the work of someone who'd been thinking about this for months, who'd been preparing quietly while smiling at family dinners. Which meant she'd been unhappy for months. Unhappy enough to plan escape. Unhappy enough to be willing to burn bridges and walk away. My ex-wife had done that too, though her escape had been messier, filled with arguments and accusations and lawyers. She'd hired me initially, before firing me because she said it was too complicated having her ex-husband's business partner handle her divorce. We'd settled eventually, and she'd moved to California with my son, where she'd eventually married someone else. A therapist, if I remembered correctly. Someone who probably actually listened when she spoke. I hadn't been to California in 5 years. I had no idea what my ex-wife's current life looked like. And I'd convinced myself that was fine, that once the legal documents were signed, my obligation to her had ended. But looking back now, I realized the real reason I hadn't gone to visit. Because doing so would have meant acknowledging that my marriage had failed because of something I'd done. Something I'd failed to do. The house phone rang. My internal line connected to the building's front desk. "Mr. Patterson, your son is here. He says it's urgent." Of course he did. David always came when there was a problem, looking for his father to solve it. "Send him up," I said. I turned on the lights before he arrived, not wanting to be found sitting alone in the dark like some Shakespearean ghost. I was pouring myself another drink when the elevator doors opened and David stepped out, looking like he'd aged 10 years in 6 hours. His face was blotchy from crying. His shirt was rumpled. His hair stuck up on one side as if he'd been running his hands through it repeatedly. This was my son. The boy I'd pushed toward excellence, toward achievement, toward becoming someone important. And he was falling apart. "Dad," he said, and his voice cracked on the single syllable. "I don't know what to do." I gestured to the sofa. "Sit down." He sat, and I handed him the drink I'd been pouring for myself. He took it without objection and drained half of it immediately. We sat in silence for a moment, the city lights twinkling beyond my windows like 1,000 small fires. "Tell me about your mother," I said finally. "What do you mean?" "Tell me about Margaret. Not the situation. Tell me about who she is." David looked at me like I'd asked the question in another language. She was. "I don't know, Dad. She was just always there. Taking care of things. Making sure the kids were okay. Cooking dinner. I didn't really think about it." "Exactly," I said, and the bitterness in my voice surprised me. "You didn't think about her. Neither did I, apparently. We just expected her to be there, doing all those things, grateful for the opportunity to help, never asking for anything in return." "That's not fair," David said, but his voice had no conviction. "I gave her everything. We gave her everything." "Did you?" I leaned back in my chair, studying my son as if he were a witness on a stand, and I was trying to establish which parts of his testimony were lies. "Or did you let her give you everything while you accepted it as your due?" David didn't respond, just drank more of his drink. "When was the last time you asked your mother what she wanted?" I continued. "Not what she wanted to cook for dinner or what she wanted to buy for the grandchildren. What she wanted for herself." I don't remember," David admitted. "I do," I said quietly. "I remember when I realized I'd never asked your mother, my ex-wife, what she actually wanted out of life. I just assumed she wanted what I wanted. Career success. Achievement. Power. And when she wanted something different, something that didn't fit into my worldview, I treated it as a betrayal instead of a difference of opinion." I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city that had always seemed so much smaller and more manageable than the complicated landscape of human relationships. "Your mother left you because you left her first," I said. "Not physically, but emotionally. You stopped seeing her as a person and started seeing her as infrastructure. A way to make your life easier. And when she finally couldn't bear it anymore, she did the one thing that would make you really see her. By stealing from us." "By taking what she'd earned," I corrected. "Every cent she'd spent on that house, that furniture, that refrigerator, those were her labor made manifest. You just didn't notice because she was invisible. Women often are, in families like ours." David flinched at that, and I almost felt bad. But not quite. Sometimes the truth requires a certain amount of harshness to penetrate. "What do I do?" David asked again, smaller this time. "How do I fix this?" I turned from the window to face him directly. "I don't know that you can fix it, David. And I'm not sure you should try to. Your mother made a choice. She's gone now. Living somewhere else, presumably somewhere that feels safer, more respectful. And you're sitting here trying to figure out how to get your appliances back instead of asking yourself the harder question." "What question?" "Why did she feel like she had to leave?" I said. "And more importantly, are you willing to change enough to deserve her forgiveness if she's ever willing to offer it?" The second question was the one I'd asked myself every day since my wife had left. The answer, I'd come to understand, was that change required more than good intentions. It required actually seeing the person you'd taken for granted and recognizing their humanity. I wasn't sure David was capable of that yet. But then again, I hadn't been either, until it was too late. The small claims courtroom smelled like old wood and floor polish, the kind of smell that seems to exist in every government building regardless of location or era. I sat at the plaintiff's table with my blue folder open before me, feeling oddly calm despite the weight of what was about to happen. My lawyer, a sharp woman named Catherine who specialized in property disputes, sat beside me, reviewing her notes one final time. Across the room, David and Christine were doing the same. Christine's jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscles working. David looked like he hadn't slept in days. Their attorney, some corporate shark in an expensive suit that probably cost more than my car, kept leaning over to whisper things that made David's face grow darker. I'd invited Margaret to sit with me, but she'd declined. "This is your fight," she'd said gently. "I've done what I needed to do. Now you have to decide what you're going to do." Margaret had moved out 3 weeks ago. Not dramatically, not with anger, but with a kind of quiet determination that suggested she'd been planning this far longer than I'd realized. The movers had come on a Friday while David and Christine were at work, and by evening, she was gone. The house felt cavernous after that, echoing with the absence of her presence. No coffee in the morning. No sound of her moving through the kitchen. No one asking how my day had been. Just silence, and the slow realization of what I'd lost. The judge entered, and we all stood. She was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and the kind of face that suggested she'd seen every variation of human conflict and was thoroughly unimpressed by most of it. She settled into her seat and pulled the case file toward her. "Wright versus Patterson," she said, adjusting her glasses. "This is a property dispute regarding items removed from the marital residence without the knowledge or consent of the other occupants. Mr. Wright, you're the plaintiff. Please explain your claim." David stood. His voice wavered slightly as he began speaking about the emotional trauma of returning home to find everything gone. About how we depended on his father for those things, how it felt like a betrayal of trust, how we'd done everything for him and this was how he repaid us. He made it sound reasonable. He made it sound like his father had done something cruel and unexpected. When he finished, the judge turned to me. Catherine squeezed my arm gently and nodded. I stood, and for a moment, I felt the weight of everything settle on my shoulders. 40 years of building. 40 years of believing that providing was the same as parenting. 40 years of being the smartest person in the room while missing the one thing that actually mattered. "Your Honor," I began, my voice steadier than I felt, "my son is correct that I removed those items from the house. But the reason he's not mentioning is why I removed them. I removed them because I finally understood that I'd been using my money to substitute for my presence. I'd been paying for a relationship instead of building one." I pulled out documents from my folder. These are financial records of every significant gift I've given my son over the past 15 years. They total approximately $2.3 million. Not loans. Gifts. Because I never once asked for repayment. I never once held them over his head, though perhaps I should have. I watched David's face go pale. "But here's what I learned recently," I continued. "Real love doesn't come with a price tag. Real family doesn't leave you behind in a note. And a father who's given everything except his actual time, his actual presence, his actual attention, that father hasn't really given anything at all." The courtroom was silent. I took back those items because they were mine. I purchased them. I have receipts for every single one. And I did it because I needed my son to finally see me. Not as an ATM. Not as a safety net. But as a person who mattered. Catherine handed the judge copies of everything. Receipts, bank statements, emails showing the progression of gifts over the years, screenshots of text messages where David had asked for help with various financial crises. The judge read through them with increasing clarity about what had actually happened in this family. When David's lawyer tried to argue that the gifts had been made with the implied understanding that they were family property, the judge cut him off. "That's not how property law works," she said flatly. "These items were purchased by Mr. Patterson and belong to him. The emotional arguments about family obligation are irrelevant to the legal question of ownership." She looked directly at David. "Mr. Wright, you've presented no evidence that you purchased any of these items. Mr. Patterson has presented clear documentation that he did. The case is dismissed." The gavel came down with a finality that echoed through the courtroom. David's face crumpled. Christine's eyes filled with tears, whether from anger or despair, I couldn't tell. Their lawyer was already gathering his papers, already moving on to the next case, the next client, the next problem to be solved for a fee. As I stood to leave, David stood as well. "Dad," he said, his voice breaking, "please. We can work this out." I looked at my son, really looked at him, for perhaps the first time in years. I saw a man who'd never learned to stand on his own 2 feet. A man who'd been so accustomed to me catching him every time he fell that he'd never developed the strength to catch himself. And I realized something that made my chest ache with a grief I hadn't anticipated. I'd done this to him. In trying to be the best father I could, in trying to solve every problem and prevent every pain, I'd crippled him in ways that money could never fix. "I don't know how to work this out," I said quietly. "Because working this out would require you to see me as something other than a resource to be used. And I'm not sure you know how to do that." I walked past him and out of the courtroom. In the weeks following the court decision, the full scope of what I'd done, and what David had done, became impossible to ignore. My office became something of a war zone. Margaret had apparently hired a forensic accountant to trace every dollar that had moved through the business accounts that David had access to. And what she found was staggering. Margaret came to my office on a Thursday morning, carrying a thick folder that she set on my desk without preamble. "You need to see this," she said simply. I opened it and felt something in my chest constrict. Over the past 5 years, David had been systematically moving money out of the firm's accounts. Small amounts, nothing that set off immediate alarms, but consistent and deliberate. Hundreds of thousands of dollars transferred to accounts in his name, then to shell companies, then into investments that had nothing to do with the firm's operations. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked Margaret, my voice barely above a whisper. "Because you needed to discover it yourself," she said. "You needed to understand that your son didn't just take your time and your attention for granted. He also stole from you." I made phone calls that afternoon that initiated a full audit of the firm's finances. What the auditors discovered made the money he'd taken look quaint. David had been systematically embezzling from the firm for nearly a decade, using his position as my son, as someone I trusted implicitly, to move money and falsify documents. The total came to just over $1.8 million. I called him into my office. My son arrived an hour later, his face already anxious, already sensing that something had shifted in the world. I didn't yell. I didn't rage. I simply showed him the audit results and asked him to explain. He couldn't. Or rather, he could, but the explanations were all variations on the same theme. That he'd felt pressured by my success. That he'd wanted to prove he could make it on his own but had needed capital to do so. That he'd planned to pay it back once his business succeeded. That he'd felt entitled to it because I was his father and he was my son, and surely that meant something. "It means something," I agreed quietly. "It means I failed you in every way that matters. And apparently, I failed my business as well." He left my office without another word. I didn't fire him that day, though I should have. Instead, I began the process of untangling years of financial deception, of protecting the firm from the damage he'd caused, of making sure that the other partners didn't suffer for the crimes of my son. It took 3 months to fully document everything. 3 months of sleepless nights and calls with lawyers and conversations with my partners about the best way to handle the situation without destroying the reputation of the firm. In the end, we reached an agreement with David that was as generous as I could make it under the circumstances. He would resign from the firm immediately. He would agree to restitution arrangements for the embezzled funds, to be paid back over a period of years. In exchange, we wouldn't press criminal charges. It was a decision that haunted me, but it was also a decision made with the understanding that pressing charges would destroy what was left of my relationship with my son, and I was beginning to understand that there might not be much left to destroy anyway. The day David signed the documents, I was in my office, waiting. He came in looking like a man who'd aged 10 years in 3 months. His eyes were hollow. His hands shook as he held the pen. "I'm sorry," he said, and I believed him. I believed that he was sorry. I just wasn't sure if he was sorry for what he'd done or sorry that he'd been caught. "So am I said. "More than you probably realize." He left the firm that day, and I haven't spoken to him since. The hardest part wasn't the money. Money can be recovered, replaced, rebuilt. What was harder was understanding the years I'd wasted, the relationship I'd neglected, the son I'd never actually known because I'd been too busy trying to be his savior to be his father. Margaret had been right about so many things, though I didn't tell her that often enough. She'd organized a dinner about 6 months after everything happened, inviting some people from my office, people I actually respected, people who'd been warning me about David for years but whom I'd dismissed because I was too proud to listen. I showed up, and Margaret was there, and for the first time in decades, I felt like I could breathe. "I owe you an apology," I said to her as we stood on her balcony, looking out at the city below. "Yes, you do," she agreed without rancor. "But I'm not sure an apology is what either of us actually needs." "What do we need, then?" "To stop making the same mistakes," she said simply. "To understand that love isn't something you can buy or give or control. It's something you have to earn through actual presence and actual attention." I thought about Eleanor. About how she'd tried to tell me the same thing and how I hadn't listened. About all the ways I'd failed the people who mattered most. "I don't know how to do that," I admitted. "Then learn," Margaret said. "You're a lawyer. You understand how to study something until you master it. Study people the same way. Study your life the same way. Pay attention in a way that actually matters." Over the following year, I began to rebuild my life in ways that had nothing to do with money or status or power. I cut back my hours at the firm, delegating more to partners who were actually interested in the work. I took up painting, something Eleanor had tried to teach me years ago that I dismissed as a waste of time. I volunteered at a legal aid clinic, taking cases for clients who couldn't afford representation. I discovered that helping people who had no ability to repay me felt more meaningful than any of the high-profile cases I'd won over 40 years. I also sought out a therapist, something I would have considered weakness before but which I now understood to be necessary. Dr. Keene was a woman in her 70s who didn't take any of my excuses or rationalizations. When I told her about David, about Eleanor, about the way I'd built my life around achievement and money and the belief that these things constituted love, she simply nodded. "You built a very impressive tower," she said one afternoon. "But towers are fragile. They're made to be admired, not to be lived in. And the higher you build them, the harder they fall." "How do I stop building towers?" I asked. "You have to learn to build bridges instead," she said. "Bridges connect people. Towers isolate them." 6 months into therapy, Margaret called me. We'd been in occasional contact, but it was polite and distant, the kind of contact that suggested we both knew something had shifted between us, but neither of us was quite sure how to navigate it. "I'm getting remarried," she said without preamble. I felt something twist in my chest. "Congratulations," I said, and I meant it, though it cost me something to say it. "His name is Frank. He's a retired contractor. We met at the community center where I've been volunteering." "That's wonderful. Eleanor would have liked him." There was a pause. "I think she would have," Margaret agreed. "I think she would have liked a lot of things about this version of me. The version of me that finally put down all the weight I was carrying and discovered that I could actually breathe without it." After we hung up, I sat in my office for a long time, just thinking about the sequence of events that had led us here. How David's betrayal had exposed the deeper betrayal I'd been committing against myself and everyone around me. How losing everything had taught me more about what actually mattered than decades of gaining things ever had. The year after David's resignation from the firm, I made a decision that surprised everyone who knew me. I sold my penthouse. I gave notice that I would be retiring from the firm in 5 years, that I'd be stepping back from day-to-day operations immediately, and that I'd be transitioning my cases to other partners. My colleagues thought I'd lost my mind. Margaret thought I'd finally found it. I moved into a smaller place, a modest apartment in a neighborhood that had actual human scale to it. Trees, parks, neighbors who knew each other's names. I started taking evening classes in art history at a local college, not because I needed credentials, but because I was curious about things I'd never had time to be curious about before. And one day, about 2 years after everything had fallen apart, I received a letter. It was from David, postmarked from out of state. His handwriting was neater than I remembered, more deliberate. Dad, I've been working with a therapist for over a year, trying to understand why I did the things I did. She suggested that the best step toward healing would be to tell you something you deserve to hear. I'm sorry. Not sorry I was caught. Not sorry things didn't work out the way I planned. But genuinely, deeply sorry for the ways I betrayed your trust. For taking money that wasn't mine. For lying about it. For letting you believe that I cared about you when really, I was just using you. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect anything from you, actually. I'm writing this because I need to say it, not because I need you to respond. I'm starting over. It's humbling and difficult and the hardest thing I've ever done. I have a job that barely pays enough to cover rent and food. Christine and I are separated. The kids are struggling with everything that's happened. But at least I'm being honest now. At least I'm not lying to myself about who I am and what I've done. I understand if you don't want to respond to this. But I wanted you to know that somewhere in this mess of a life I've created, I'm finally trying to become the kind of person who deserves to call someone Dad. David. I read the letter 3 times, then placed it in a frame and hung it on my wall. Not as a trophy or a vindication, but as a reminder of something important. People can change. Not easily. Not quickly. But it's possible if they're willing to do the work. I did respond to David, months later, when I felt ready. Not with forgiveness, that seemed too simple a word for what needed to happen between us. But with honesty, telling him about my own therapy, about the ways I'd failed him as a father, about the slow work of trying to become someone better than the man I'd been. We didn't reconcile in any dramatic sense. But we began a tentative correspondence, careful letters that acknowledged the damage without trying to minimize it or excuse it. It was fragile and uncertain, but it was real in a way that our relationship had never been before. 3 years after David left my firm, I received an invitation to his wedding. He was marrying someone new, a woman named Susan who worked as a social worker and who'd apparently helped him through some of the darkest days of his life. I sat looking at that invitation for a long time, uncertain whether I should go. Then I thought about Margaret, about Eleanor, about all the second chances I'd been given that I'd squandered. And I decided that maybe my son deserved at least one person in the room who understood how hard it was to change, to become better, to choose honesty over comfort. I went to the wedding. David saw me as I walked in, and his face went pale, then flushed, then settled into something that looked like cautious hope. We didn't speak much that day. But after the ceremony, as people were greeting the newlyweds, David pulled me aside. "I didn't think you'd come," he said. "Neither did I admitted. "But I decided that the whole point of becoming a better person is having the courage to show up for people, even when it's complicated." He nodded, understanding something unspoken in those words. "I'm proud of you," I said. "Not for the wedding. For the work you've done to get here." His eyes filled with tears. "I'm proud of you too, Dad. For being brave enough to change." We didn't hug. The damage between us was still too fresh for that kind of physical affection. But we stood together for a moment, 2 men who'd hurt each other deeply and were tentatively, carefully, beginning the long process of healing. Later that evening, as I watched my son dance with his new wife, I thought about the penthouse and the status and all the things I'd accumulated in my pursuit of becoming someone important. And I realized that I'd finally achieved something far more valuable than importance. I'd achieved honesty. It wasn't as impressive as a corner office or a national reputation or a bank account that could solve any problem. But it was real. It was mine. And it was the foundation upon which something genuine could finally be built. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in April, exactly 5 months after the courthouse. Spring had finally arrived in earnest, turning the world outside my apartment into something vibrant and alive. New leaves pushed through branches that had been bare since November. Flowers bloomed in window boxes throughout the building. The whole season felt like a promise being kept. I was in the community room teaching Bernard how to navigate his new tablet when Patricia, the building manager, found me with a certified letter in her hand. "This came for you," she said, handing it over with a curious expression. Something official-looking. I thanked her and set it aside until after class, though part of me already knew what it would contain. That evening, Sitting on my balcony with the spring air warming my face, I opened the envelope. It was from a lawyer. Michael's lawyer, technically, though the letter was addressed to me with a formality that suggested this was business, not family. Dear Mrs. Patterson, my client, Michael Wright, has instructed me to contact you regarding a matter of some importance. Mr. Wright has recently become aware of financial discrepancies in his business accounts dating back several years. An audit initiated by his accounting firm has revealed approximately $1.8 million in unauthorized withdrawals. While Mr. Wright is not at this time pursuing criminal charges, he wishes to establish a restitution agreement. Given your recent actions regarding the household property, Mr. Wright believes you may have information relevant to this matter. Please contact my office at your earliest convenience to discuss Mr. Wright's options. I read it twice, then set it down on my lap and looked out at the courtyard below. The fountain was running, water catching the late afternoon light. Someone had planted tulips in the garden beds, red and yellow and purple, pushing up through the dark soil with remarkable vitality. So David had discovered what I'd known all along. What I'd suspected during those early visits to the penthouse, when his son kept asking for money that seemed to disappear into black holes. What I'd confirmed when I finally hired my own accountant to look into the firm's finances. David had been stealing from his father for years. I picked up my phone and called the number on the letterhead. A receptionist answered, professional and efficient. I asked to be transferred to the attorney, and after a brief hold, a man's voice came on the line. Mrs. Patterson, this is James Harrison. Thank you for calling. I received your letter, I said simply, regarding my son's situation. There was a pause. Yes. Mr. Wright would like to discuss the possibility of... I'm not the person you need to speak with, I interrupted gently. You need to speak with Robert Patterson, the senior Mr. Patterson, the father. Another pause, this one longer. I see. Are you saying you have knowledge of these discrepancies? I'm saying that my son-in-law discovered them months ago. He's already initiated an internal audit. The documentation is thorough and professional. If Mr. Wright wants to address this matter, he should contact his father directly. I gave him Robert's office number, then hung up before the attorney could ask any more questions. I didn't know what Robert would choose to do with that information. Whether he would pursue legal action against his son, whether he would offer forgiveness, whether he would simply absorb the loss as the price of finally understanding who his son really was. That wasn't my decision to make anymore. That was between a father and his son, and I'd learned the hard way that some relationships you can't fix for other people. They have to fix themselves. What I knew was this: I'd done what needed to be done. I'd documented everything. I'd kept my evidence. And when the moment came, I'd made sure the truth was available to those who needed to hear it. The irony wasn't lost on me. In leaving Michael and Amanda, in taking what was mine, I'd inadvertently revealed what their own household had been built on. Not love, not partnership, but financial exploitation. And now, finally, someone who actually loved them, Robert, in his own complicated way, had the information he needed to demand accountability. The call from Robert came on a Friday evening. I almost didn't recognize his voice at first, but then his name appeared on my phone screen and I understood. He'd gotten my number from someone. Margaret at the law firm, probably, or perhaps Patricia had provided it when he'd called the building asking how to reach me. "Hello, Robert," I said, keeping my tone neutral but not cold. We were no longer family in any formal sense, but we were still connected by history and by David. "Margaret." His voice sounded different than I remembered. Older, maybe, or simply more human. Less certain. "I wanted to thank you." "Thank me for what?" "For everything. For the letter about David's embezzlement. For the documentation. For having the courage to leave when I couldn't. For showing me what I'd been too blind to see." I was quiet for a moment. "I didn't do any of that for you, Robert. I did it because I needed to save myself." "I know," he said simply. "And that's exactly why it was so effective." We talked for nearly an hour that evening. Robert told me about his conversation with David, about the restitution agreement they'd reached, about the therapy David was doing, about the slow, painful process of rebuilding trust from the ground up. He told me about cutting back his hours at the firm, about the small apartment he'd rented, about discovering that life could be meaningful without constant achievement. "I'm proud of you," I said when he finished, and I meant it. "I'm proud of you too," he replied. "I know that probably doesn't matter much anymore, but I wanted you to know." After we hung up, I sat with my phone in my lap, feeling the weight of that conversation. Robert and I had never been close, but there was something meaningful in knowing that he'd finally understood. That he'd changed. That the explosion of his son's deception had forced him to examine his own life and find it wanting. People can change. Not easily. Not without pain. But it's possible when they're willing to do the work. The grandchildren showed up in June, completely unexpected. I was in the community room preparing for art class when Ruth came to find me, her expression uncertain. "There are 2 young people at the front desk asking for you," she said. "They look nervous." I didn't need to ask who they were. I simply excused myself and headed downstairs, my heart beating in a way I hadn't anticipated. My granddaughter, Lily, was 13 now, tall and starting to look like a young woman instead of a girl. My grandson, Tommy, was 11, gangly in the way of pre-teens, with his mother's eyes and his father's mouth. They were standing in the lobby looking utterly out of place, both of them wearing the same uncertain expression. "Grandma," Lily said softly when she saw me. Just that one word, but it held so much weight. I approached them slowly, not wanting to assume anything, not wanting to presume they'd forgiven me or understood what had happened. "Hello, darlings. What a surprise." "Dad dropped us off," Tommy said, his voice small. "He said we should talk to you. That he's sorry he didn't let us see you before." I gestured toward the seating area, and we sat down together on one of the comfortable sofas in the lobby. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Lily took my hand. "Mom and Dad told us you were mean to them," she said carefully, as if trying out words she didn't fully understand. "But then Dad found out that wasn't true. He's been really sad about it. He said he needs to talk to you, but he wanted us to come first because we missed you." I looked at this young woman who'd been 5 years old the last time I'd truly spent time with her, and something in my chest cracked open. "I did leave you," I said, keeping my voice honest. "I didn't do it to hurt you. I did it because I had to save myself. But I understand that it hurt you anyway, and I'm sorry for that." "Are you coming home?" Tommy asked. "Home? Such a loaded word." "No, sweetheart. I'm not going back to that house. But you're welcome to come here any time. I'd love to spend time with you both." They stayed for 3 hours. I took them to my apartment and showed them my paintings, some of which Lily found genuinely impressive. We talked about school, about their lives, about the things kids and grandmothers talk about when they're getting to know each other again. I made them snacks. I listened to them. I showed them I was still their grandmother, even if I'd stopped being the kind who sacrificed everything without counting the cost. When Michael came to pick them up, I wasn't surprised that he stepped inside. He looked uncertain, like a man walking into a room where he wasn't sure he'd be welcome. And he was right to be uncertain. "Hello, Michael," I said, keeping my voice polite but measured. "Mom," he said, and his voice was raw in a way I'd never heard before. "I came to apologize. For everything. For using you. For taking what you gave and acting like it was my due. For leaving you on Thanksgiving. For suing you. For all of it." I looked at my son, really looked at him, and I saw a man who was beginning to understand the weight of his own choices. Who was trying to do better. Who wasn't asking for complete forgiveness but was genuinely attempting to make amends. "I appreciate that," I said carefully. "And I hope you continue that work with a therapist. That's where the real healing has to happen, Michael. Not with me, but within yourself." "I know," he said quietly. "I've been seeing someone. Every week. And Amanda is too. We're trying to figure out who we are beyond just taking from people." I nodded. It was the best I could hope for. The children are always welcome here. But you and I, that's going to take time. If it happens at all. He nodded, understanding. "That's fair. That's more than fair." After they left, I stood in my apartment looking at the slight disorder their visit had caused. Crumbs on the coffee table. A pillow out of place. Evidence of life and family and connection. Instead of immediately tidying, I left it as it was. Let myself sit with the messiness of it. Let myself acknowledge that even though Michael and I might never have the kind of relationship we'd had before, we could perhaps build something new. Something more honest. By August, I'd established a new rhythm. Tuesdays and Thursdays I taught art at the community center. Wednesdays I volunteered at the library. Weekends I spent with Ruth and my other friends, or I painted, or I simply existed in my small apartment doing exactly what I wanted to do. The children visited once a month. Michael called every other week. Amanda, tentatively, began reaching out via text. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no moment where everything was suddenly fixed. But there was a slow thawing, a gradual acknowledgement that we'd all made mistakes and were trying to do better. I received a holiday card from Robert in November. Inside, he'd written a personal message thanking me again, wishing me well, telling me he was proud of the man his son was becoming. He'd included a photograph. Robert, David, Christine, and the children at Thanksgiving dinner. All together, all present, all choosing each other. There was an empty chair in the photograph too, positioned at the table. Waiting. I didn't know if it was intended as a symbol or just accident. But either way, it moved me. That December, for Christmas, my grandchildren gave me a gift. A beautiful frame with a photograph inside. The four of us together, taken during their June visit. Lily and Tommy on either side of me, both smiling. Me in the middle, my arms around them, my expression radiating something I'd struggled to find for so long. Joy. Real, uncomplicated joy. I hung that photograph on my wall, right next to Harold's eternal smile. And every morning when I woke, I saw both of them. The man who'd loved me first and set the standard for what real partnership looked like. And the grandchildren who were learning, slowly, that I was worth knowing. That I had value beyond what I could give. On the first anniversary of the day I'd moved out, I made a small dinner for myself. Nothing fancy, just something I wanted to eat, prepared exactly how I wanted it, enjoyed at my own pace. Afterward, I sat on my balcony with chamomile tea, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. A year ago, I'd been sitting in a penthouse grieving a marriage that had failed. Months before that, I'd been invisible in a household that treated me as infrastructure rather than family. I'd been so afraid of silence then. Afraid it meant I was alone. Afraid it meant I didn't matter. But I'd learned something important in this year of carefully chosen solitude. Silence isn't emptiness. It's space. It's room to hear your own thoughts, your own needs, your own voice telling you what you're worth. I'd learned that you can love people and still leave them. That you can forgive while maintaining boundaries. That healing isn't about reconciliation. It's about reclaiming yourself from the people who've convinced you that your worth comes from what you do for them rather than who you are. My phone buzzed. A text from Ruth. Card game tomorrow? Bernard and Louise want you there. 8 p.m. I smiled and responded, I'll bring cookies. Because that was the thing about building a new life. It wasn't about being alone. It was about choosing your people. Creating family from friendship. Building something based on mutual respect rather than obligation. I finished my tea and went inside, locking the balcony door against the cool night air. My apartment felt warm, lived in, entirely mine. Every piece of furniture, every picture on the wall, every small detail reflected my choices and my life. Tomorrow I'd have coffee with my friends. Next week, the children would visit. Next month, Michael wanted to take me to lunch, just the two of us, to talk about rebuilding our relationship. But tonight, I simply existed in my own space, grateful for the woman I'd become. The woman who'd had the courage to walk away. Who'd documented everything. Who'd stood in a courtroom and claimed what was hers. Who'd finally learned that the most important thing she could give herself was freedom. I turned off the lights and went to bed, my sleep deep and untroubled, my dreams my own. Because I'd finally learned the most valuable lesson of all. You can't buy your way out of the work of becoming whole. But you can walk away from the people who profit from your incompleteness. And sometimes, that's the bravest thing you can do.